Could a man without a law degree really expose corruption in open court? Malcolm Reese wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't powerful, he wasn't rich. But when the system tried to erase his family's history, he did the impossible. He fought back, alone. And what started as a desperate battle for his home turned into a war that could bring down an entire institution. This is the story of how one man took on a corrupt bank and forced the world to watch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked wooden porch as Malcolm Reese stood frozen, gripping the eviction notice in his trembling hands. The paper was thin, but it felt heavier than anything he had ever held. His mother's name, Ella Reese, was printed in bold letters, followed by a cold, merciless declaration. Final notice. Property to be vacated in 14 days. His chest tightened. This house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was history. 3 generations of Reese family memories were tucked inside. The laughter of childhood, the quiet hum of his mother's prayers at night, the scent of Sunday morning pancakes still lingering in the worn wooden floors. Ella Reese had worked 2 jobs, sacrificed sleep, and poured her entire life into paying off this house. And now, a single sheet of paper claimed it was no longer theirs. Malcolm stormed inside, his fingers shaking as he ripped open the old file cabinet. Faded mortgage statements, tax receipts, and the original deed, all proof that his mother had paid off this house. But then, tucked between the pages, he found something new, something he had never seen before. A second mortgage agreement. His stomach dropped. It bore his mother's signature, but the handwriting looked off, shaky, uneven, unfamiliar. Malcolm's mother had never mentioned a second mortgage. Why would she? She had celebrated burning the original paperwork, proud that she was finally free from the grip of the banks. So why was this document here? And who had signed it? His first call to the bank was met with indifference. After nearly 30 minutes on hold, a woman's clipped, disinterested voice finally answered. Foreclosure Department, First Union Bank. Malcolm took a breath, trying to steady his frustration. I'm calling about an eviction notice for Ella Reese's property. There's been a mistake. The mortgage was paid off. There was a pause, then a sigh. The account is in default due to non-payment on a second mortgage taken out 2 years ago. Foreclosure proceedings are final. Malcolm's pulse pounded in his ears. That's impossible. My mother never took out a second mortgage. The woman's tone turned patronizing. Maybe you weren't aware of her financial situation. Malcolm gritted his teeth. The insinuation hit like a slap. He had handled his mother's finances after her stroke. He knew every transaction. I need copies of every document related to this loan, he demanded. File a request with our legal department, the woman replied coolly. But it won't stop the eviction. The line went dead. Malcolm's knuckles turned white around his phone. This wasn't a clerical error. This was something else. Something bigger. Someone was lying. He needed answers. The next morning, Malcolm drove straight to First Union Bank. The glass doors slid open, and the cold sterility of corporate indifference washed over him. He marched to the front desk, demanding to speak with the branch manager. Minutes later, Darren Clean stepped out from his office, middle-aged, clean-cut, smug. He didn't even bother hiding his bored disdain as he glanced over Malcolm's paperwork. People like you need to learn, Clean said, sliding the documents back across the desk. The system isn't made for you. Malcolm leaned forward, voice low. That signature isn't my mother's. Look closely. Clean barely glanced at the document before smirking. Signatures change over time. People get desperate, make bad decisions. Malcolm's jaw tightened. She didn't take out this loan, and you know it. Clean finally looked up, eyes gleaming with amusement. Then hire a lawyer. But act fast. You've got 2 weeks. Malcolm walked out, boiling with anger. He couldn't afford a lawyer. He couldn't afford to waste time. The first realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted him out. Malcolm's first stop was the legal aid office. A cramped waiting room with flickering fluorescent lights and chairs bolted to the floor. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman with thick glasses, barely glanced up as he slid his documents across the counter. I need help fighting an illegal foreclosure, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She skimmed through his papers, sighing before shaking her head. We're at capacity. Malcolm's stomach sank. You don't even know my case. Doesn't matter, she said flatly. These cases take months, sometimes years. And respectfully, Mr. Reese, we don't take cases we can't win. He didn't have months. He had 10 days. Firm after firm gave him the same answer. Some didn't even bother calling back. Others cited conflicts of interest. Malcolm knew what that meant. First Union Bank was powerful, with deep pockets and deep connections. No one wanted to go up against them. By the time he left the last law office, dusk had settled over the city. His phone buzzed. Naya. Any luck? Malcolm. None. No one will take the case. Naya. So what now? What now? He had no attorney, no plan, and only 10 days before the sheriff arrived to throw him out. His last hope was Councilman Brent Holloway, a man who built his reputation on community outreach. If anyone could help, it was him, or so Malcolm thought. The town hall meeting was already wrapping up when Malcolm caught Holloway by the doors, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras. Councilman, I need your help. Malcolm thrust the eviction notice toward him. First Union is forcing me out of my home. My mother's house. They used a forged signature. Holloway barely glanced at the paperwork before offering a practiced, tight-lipped smile. I sympathize with your situation, he said smoothly, patting Malcolm's shoulder like a teacher comforting a struggling student. But the bank followed procedure. Malcolm's fists clenched. Procedure? My mother's signature was forged. Holloway sighed, his tone shifting from polite to condescending. History doesn't pay the bills, son. There it was. That word, son, said like Malcolm was a child, an inconvenience, a lost cause. The councilman nodded at an aide, signaling he was done with the conversation, then turned back toward the cameras. Malcolm's hands trembled with frustration. The system had already decided. They weren't just letting this happen. They wanted it to happen. By the time Malcolm got home, it was past midnight. He sank into the old wooden chair at the kitchen table, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. The house was silent. Too silent. No more laughter from his mother. No more late-night conversations. Just him, alone, fighting a battle he wasn't supposed to win. The eviction notice sat in front of him like a death sentence. 10 days left. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he couldn't sleep. He reached for his laptop and, on a desperate whim, typed, "Mortgage fraud cases." Pages of foreclosure horror stories filled the screen. Families evicted due to errors, predatory loans, rushed court filings. But one case stood out. Martin versus Horizon Bank. The homeowner had successfully stopped foreclosure after proving the mortgage transfer was invalid. His key discovery? A forged signature. Malcolm's pulse kicked up. He clicked deeper into the case, then another, then another. This wasn't an accident. This was a pattern. For the first time in days, something flickered in Malcolm's chest. Not fear, not frustration, hope. If no one would fight for him, he'd fight for himself. The library was cold and quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound as Malcolm hunched over a stack of law books, eyes burning from exhaustion. Foreclosure statutes, discovery motions, fraudulent conveyance claims. The words blurred together, but he forced himself to keep reading. Every page was a puzzle piece, every case a potential lifeline. If the system wanted to crush him, then he had one option left: learn the system better than they did. Night after night, he stayed until the library closed, fueled by black coffee and desperation. One case stood out: Wilson versus Harbor Bank. The homeowner had stopped an eviction by filing a motion to stay based on potential fraud. That was it. His first real move. At 9 a.m. sharp, Malcolm walked into the courthouse, clutching the motion to stay eviction. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a weary expression, barely glanced at him. "Representing yourself?" she asked, unimpressed. "Yes," Malcolm said, trying to keep his voice steady. She sighed and stamped the paperwork. "The judge will review it, but don't get your hopes up." He didn't have hope. He had facts. The hearing was a formality. Judge Ethan Crawley, gray-haired, impatient, barely looking up from his notes, called Malcolm forward. "Mr. Reese, you're requesting a stay of eviction?" His tone was bored. Malcolm nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The bank used fraudulent documents to justify foreclosure. I've submitted evidence." Crawley waved a hand. "There's no clear basis for fraud here. The bank followed procedure." The same words Holloway used. But, bang! The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. Motion denied. Just like that. Malcolm's fingers curled into fists as the bailiff motioned for him to leave. It wasn't just a denial. It was a message. This court wasn't here to hear him. It was here to process him. When Malcolm returned home, the final nail in the coffin was waiting for him. A sheriff's notice was taped to his front door, flapping in the wind like a death warrant. Eviction scheduled. 5 days. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a countdown. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, his mother's old mortgage papers spread in front of him. The second mortgage agreement sat on top, taunting him. The signature was wrong. The dates were wrong. But none of it mattered if he couldn't prove it. There was one place left to go. The bank was quiet when Malcolm walked through the glass doors. But the moment he demanded to see the original loan documents, a hush fell over the lobby. A few minutes later, Darren Clean appeared, adjusting his tie as he walked toward Malcolm with thinly veiled amusement. "Mr. Reese," he said, leaning against the counter. "What can I do for you?" Malcolm slammed the second mortgage paperwork onto the counter. "Show me the original loan documents. Now." Clean didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, he just smirked. "File a discovery request." Malcolm's stomach turned. A bureaucratic delay tactic. A stall. Malcolm had learned enough by now to know what this meant. If the bank had the real documents, they'd have produced them already. They were hiding something. And now, Malcolm knew exactly where to start digging. Malcolm walked into the courthouse alone, gripping the discovery motion like a weapon. He had spent the past 3 nights buried in foreclosure law, his only companions a dim library lamp and the burning weight of injustice pressing against his chest. Now, it was time to make his move. At the clerk's desk, he slid the papers forward. "I'm requesting full discovery of all documents tied to my mother's mortgage." The clerk, a young black woman named Tasha, glanced at the filing, then at him. Her brow lifted. "You're fighting First Union?" "Yeah." She exhaled, stamping the papers with a solid thunk. "Most people give up by now." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I'm not most people." The request was filed. The bank had 7 days to produce everything. But he had barely walked out of the courthouse before they struck back. The first hit came the next morning. Malcolm stopped at a gas station on his way to the library. His card declined. Confused, he checked his banking app. Account frozen. Fraud investigation pending. His hands tightened around his phone. Fraud? There was no fraud, except the kind First Union was committing against him. He called customer service, only to be transferred, delayed, and finally met with a cold, scripted response. "Your account is under review. This process may take several weeks." Weeks? He had 5 days before eviction. The second hit came that night. As he walked out of the library, his usual spot on the curb was empty. His car was gone. A neighbor confirmed it. A tow truck had taken it an hour ago. Malcolm checked his emails. Repossession notice. Delinquent payment. It didn't make sense. He was never late. But now, every automatic payment had bounced the moment his account was frozen. It wasn't just retaliation. They were cutting off every means of survival. Malcolm spent that night in his car, or what was left of it, sitting in a borrowed Honda Civic, parked behind the community center, staring at his phone like it could somehow tell him what to do next. That's when Nia called. "Malcolm," she whispered, voice low and panicked. "2 men came to my job today. Asked my manager if I was involved in illegal activity." Malcolm sat up. "What?" "My boss said if I bring any more heat, I'm fired." His stomach twisted. They weren't just coming after him. They were coming after everyone around him. Nia was silent for a long moment. Then, "Malcolm, maybe it's time to stop." His grip on the steering wheel tightened. No, stopping wasn't an option. He had one last move to make. That night, under the dim glow of his laptop screen, Malcolm combed through every mortgage transfer linked to his house. And then he saw it. A missing endorsement. By law, when a mortgage was transferred between lenders, each transfer required a signature from the previous lender. It was a crucial step, one that gave a bank the legal right to foreclose. But on the final transfer to First Union Bank, no signature, no endorsement, nothing. Malcolm's hands trembled. They never had the legal right to foreclose. His breath came fast, his heart hammering. This was it, the crack in their foundation, the proof that could bring the whole house of lies crumbling down. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras ready. The gallery buzzed with quiet murmurs, the weight of anticipation hanging in the air. At the defendant's table, Malcolm sat alone. No lawyer, no firm behind him, just a folder of documents and the fire in his chest. Across from him, First Union Bank had sent their best. Bryce Lambert, the bank's top attorney. A man whose custom suit probably cost more than Malcolm's entire mortgage. He sat with calculated ease, flipping through paperwork like this was just another routine foreclosure. Judge Ethan Crawley leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly. "Mr. Reese, you may proceed." Malcolm stood, gripping the discovery documents like a lifeline. "Your Honor, The bank claims it had the right to foreclose on my home. But there's a problem. He stepped forward, placing a file on the judge's bench. They never legally owned the mortgage. A hush fell over the room. Judge Crawley's gaze flicked down at the papers. Explain. Malcolm took a steady breath. When a mortgage is transferred between lenders, it requires an endorsement, a legal signature from the previous lender. He tapped a specific page in the file. This document shows the last transfer of my mortgage to First Union Bank. He let the silence stretch before delivering the blow. But there's no endorsement, no signature, no legal transfer. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Lambert didn't react, didn't flinch. He simply rose from his seat, smooth and calculated. Your Honor, Lambert said, voice rich with practiced authority. This is nothing more than a clerical error. A clerical error. Malcolm let out a short laugh. A clerical error? He turned, facing the courtroom. You're telling me this billion-dollar institution just forgot to file the single document that gave them the legal right to take my home? Lambert gave a slow, measured smile. Mistakes happen, Mr. Reese. Malcolm stepped forward, voice steady. Then show us the original documents. The courtroom went still. Lambert's fingers tightened around his folder, but his expression didn't waver. Controlled. Too controlled. Judge Crawley shifted in his seat. Mr. Lambert, he said, rubbing his temple. Can the bank provide the original endorsed transfer document? Lambert hesitated, only for a second, but it was long enough. Crawley sighed heavily. He looked from Lambert to Malcolm, then back again. The court orders First Union Bank to produce the original documents within 7 days. The gavel banged. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. For the first time, Malcolm had forced them to play defense. 3 days. That's how long the bank waited before striking back. Malcolm had forced them into a corner. Now, they were about to show him just how ruthless they could be. He was at the library when his phone buzzed. An email from the court. Eviction approved. New evidence submitted. His stomach dropped. New evidence? His fingers shook as he opened the file. A newly notarized mortgage transfer. Clean. Precise. The missing endorsement was suddenly there. But Malcolm knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake being corrected. This was a cover-up. They had fabricated the paperwork, and the judge had rubber-stamped it without a second thought. He didn't even have time to react before his phone rang again. Nia. Malcolm. Get home. Now. By the time he arrived, the damage was already done. His front door was wide open. A sheriff's deputy stood on the porch, arms crossed. Behind him, movers hauled out his mother's couch, his childhood bed, the coffee table where she used to sit with her morning tea, dumped onto the sidewalk like trash. Malcolm's breath came short and fast. You can't do this. There's a court order. The deputy barely looked at him. That order was overruled. Overruled? Malcolm clenched his fists. By who? The deputy sighed as if bored. Take it up with the bank. Malcolm took a step forward, rage burning in his chest. This is my home. And then he heard it. A low click. He turned his head. Another officer had unsnapped his holster. Just enough to be a warning. Back down. Or else. Nia grabbed his arm. Malcolm, not like this. His jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. But she was right. Not like this. 30 minutes later, he was homeless. Everything he owned scattered on the street. The house, his mother's house, was gone. And then the final blow landed. A patrol car pulled up beside him. 2 officers stepped out. Malcolm Reese? His hands curled into fists. What now? The taller cop smirked. You're under arrest for trespassing. On his own damn property. That night, Malcolm sat in a holding cell. His body aching from hours on a cold metal bench. His mind racing. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about power. The bank wasn't just trying to take his house. They were trying to erase him. And that's when the realization hit him. They want me to walk away. Which meant, they're scared. Malcolm was down, but he wasn't out. He sat at the back of a 24-hour diner, stirring a cup of coffee he couldn't afford. His phone sat on the table, the eviction still fresh on the screen. That's when the text came. Unknown number. We need to talk. It's about the bank. 5 minutes later, Linda Ortiz slid into the seat across from him. Mid-30s. Sharp eyes. A nervous energy she tried to hide. Her ID badge was gone, but Malcolm could tell. She was corporate. Or at least she used to be. You don't know me, she said quietly, glancing around the diner. But I know what they did to you. Malcolm didn't blink. And who exactly are you? Linda hesitated, then leaned in. I worked for First Union, in legal, until I quit last month. Malcolm raised a brow. Why? She slid a thick folder across the table. Because of this. He hesitated, then flipped it open. Internal emails, confidential memos, and at the center of it all, his case. His stomach turned as he scanned the first email. Priority. Processing for high-risk foreclosures. Minimize litigation risk by expediting evictions before formal challenges can be filed. The word high risk was highlighted. Malcolm's jaw clenched. What does high risk mean? Linda exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead. It means black and brown neighborhoods. Malcolm stared at her. She kept going. The bank knew these foreclosures wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, so they rushed them. They counted on people not knowing their rights, on courts rubber-stamping evictions before anyone could fight back. Malcolm's hands tightened around the folder. And you're telling me this now? Linda swallowed. Because if this gets out, it could bring the whole system down. Malcolm barely made it back to his motel room before tearing into the documents. Everything he needed was here. Names, dates, evidence that the bank had knowingly falsified mortgage transfers. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a scandal. A systemic attack on minority homeowners. And now, Malcolm had the proof. He grabbed his laptop, started drafting his next court motion. This was it. The game changer. But before he could hit print, the door burst open. Malcolm barely had time to react before two masked men rushed inside. One shoved him back against the wall. The other went straight for the folder. Malcolm struggled, but the first punch landed hard in his gut, knocking the wind out of him. By the time he caught his breath, the folder was gone. One of them leaned in, voice low, almost amused. Walk away, Reese. Then they were gone. Malcolm stumbled forward, pain flaring through his ribs. His motel room was wrecked. His laptop? Smashed. His notes? Shredded. The evidence was gone. The message was clear. Walk away. But Malcolm wasn't walking away, because the bank had just made a mistake. They thought that was his only copy. It wasn't. Malcolm wiped the blood from his mouth, grabbed his phone, and started making calls. This time, he wasn't just fighting in court. He was going public. The courtroom was overflowing. Reporters, activists, homeowners who had lost everything. They all packed the gallery, waiting to see if a janitor-turned-legal expert could take down a billion-dollar bank. At the plaintiff's table, Bryce Lambert sat with his usual polished arrogance. Across from him, Malcolm Reese sat alone. No lawyer. Just a flash drive in his pocket, and the truth on his side. Judge Crawley sighed heavily as he adjusted his glasses. Let's make this quick, Mr. Reese. Malcolm stood, voice steady. Your Honor, this case isn't about a mortgage anymore. It's about fraud, manipulation, a system designed to strip people like me of everything we own. Lambert gave a fake, patient smile. Mr. Reese has no substantial evidence. Just conspiracy theories. The foreclosure was lawful, and this hearing is a waste of the court's time. Malcolm smirked. Then you won't mind if I show one last piece of evidence. Before Crawley could respond, Malcolm reached into his pocket, pulled out the flash drive, and plugged it into the courtroom monitor. The screen flickered to life. A grainy security video. A conference room. Darren Clean. Bryce Lambert. A team of bank executives. And then, the words that sealed their fate. If we delay processing just enough, the courts will side with us. The courtroom exploded. Gasps. Murmurs. Reporters scrambling for their phones. Judge Crawley's face went pale. Lambert shot to his feet. This is taken out of context. Boyd stood from the gallery. Let the record show that this video was submitted with verified metadata. It is authentic. Lambert was drowning. Your Honor, this is... Crawley banged the gavel so hard it echoed. Enough. Sit. Down. Lambert sank into his chair, his jaw clenched so tight his face turned red. Judge Crawley exhaled. Then, in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade, this foreclosure is nullified. Effective immediately. The courtroom erupted. It was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Lambert. His smugness was gone. Malcolm watched as the man who had tried to destroy his life was now trying to outrun cameras. A voice cut through the noise. You won. He turned. Nia. Her eyes shone with something between relief and disbelief. How does it feel? Malcolm looked at the bank's legal team, scrambling, sweating, collapsing under the weight of their own corruption. Then at the people watching, waiting, hoping, and he smiled. Like I'm just getting started. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a war for justice. And Malcolm Reese proved that power doesn't belong to those with money. It belongs to those who refuse to back down. If you believe in standing up against corruption, like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be told.